G'day painters, welcome back to Bellamar's Miniatures. Today we're painting a gyrocopter for my old world dwarfs. Let's paint. As normal for my dwarfs, I sprayed them with a grey Seer rattle can, then Vampiric Purple Xpress colour through my airbrush. This is because I decided to use purple as my only shadow colour for my entire army. It was a new technique I wanted to try out, and as I'm nearing the end of the army project, I'm pretty happy with how it's worked out so far. As you can see, the first colour I blocked in was oak brown. I went back and forth on whether I should do the wood as a painted colour or leave it as wood. As I've mentioned before, my headcanon for my dwarves is that their clan is high up in the mountains, so wood is pretty rare for them. So they save it for things like gyrocopters and other war machines where they need to save the weight. Because of this, I figured they'd probably not paint the wood and let it show. If it's so rare, they'd want to show it off. So the wood stays. Next it was time to get some of my army colours in, and I started with the red. There won't be much red on this model, just on the rotor blades. I start with Basilisk Red because it covers nicely in one coat, and I can build my normal red recipe up from this. I'm being careful to avoid the recesses as I do this, just to keep the nice dark purple showing in the shadows. Then it was time for my second army colour, the blue. As well as the rotor blades, the wings will also be blocked in with the blue. Once again, I'm being careful to avoid the recesses. You'll also notice I'm leaving the patches for now. I decided they look like they're quick patches rather than proper fixes, so they wouldn't have been done with the coloured leather, so I'll paint them when I do the rest of the leathers later. Then it's time for the Vampire Red. This is the base colour I use for my red recipe. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover very well by itself, which is why I use the Basilisk Red first as a base. Then the Vampire Red goes on nicely and just gives a good finish to build up from. Next, it's time for the leathers. With leather brown, I do the seat, the patches on the rotor blades, and the couple of bags that are spread around the model. There isn't much leather on this model, but the few spots that has it, it works nicely to break up the other colours a bit. I think they're well placed and gives the model some nice character. For the fur on the top of the seat, I use uniform grey. Once again, this decision was dictated by the location of my clan's hold. Being high in the mountains, any animals they hunt would likely have grey or white furs. Next was the longest step for this model, the metal. It's not so much that there's a lot of metal on this model, it's more that you need to take your time and be careful when doing it. A lot of the metal is up against parts I've already painted, and I'd rather not have to spend too much time tidying things up if I can avoid it. Even with that, 36 minutes isn't really that long. This next step is optional and will come down to your opinion. I think the metal needs to be broken up a bit, and since there isn't really anywhere else to add gold to the model, I decided to use it here to break up the metal. So I used hammered copper to block in the straps, joins and brackets. Just those sort of details that'll help break up the metal a bit. For the bombs, I didn't do anything fancy, just block them in black. And for another splash of colour, I do the gorge as Hydra Turquoise. Next it's time to establish some shadows, so I break out purple tone and get to work. For the wood, I'm making sure to get the wash into all the recesses. I'm not worried about being too neat, as it'll help with the wood grain effect later anyway. On the metal, I was more picky about where I put it, trying to only place it where I think the shadows would be, and in a few key spots that need that definition. With the oak brown, I go back and start working on the wood grain. I'm being pretty rough with this, the only thing I'm really being careful about is staying out of the recesses. I'm working in the direction of the wood grain and just picking it out to give some variety, as you'd expect to see on wood. Then with fur brown, I continue to do the same, though this time I'm being more careful. I'm only picking out some of the grain, making sure to leave some variety, and try to give it a nice wood grain finish. I also did all the edge highlights on the wood with the fur brown. The edge highlights for the wood are really easy on this model. Pretty much all of it is easily accessible, so I can just run the side of my brush along it. For highlighting the leathers, it's a 50-50 mix of leather brown and ancient stone. This is a pretty quick and easy step. There isn't much leather, so I just hit it with some edge highlights and some scratchy highlights to give the leather a bit of texture. I went back and forth on how I wanted to highlight the rotor blades. In the end, I settled on trying to highlight them to make it look like they're spinning. So I edge highlight the leading edge and then did highlights down the middle of each section, getting thinner as it moved away from the leading edge. Then with pure red, I did the same thing, working in a smaller area to leave some of the previous layer showing. And then I did the same with the blues, starting with deep blue for the first layer. And while I do that, why don't you hit the subscribe button? According to YouTube analytics, over 80% of the people watching my videos aren't subscribed. So why not subscribe? It's free and it helps my channel out a lot. Then Ultramarine Blue for the next layer. Seeing the blue next to the red, I felt like the red wasn't getting the same effect as the blue and I needed to go a bit brighter. So I used Legendary Red to go brighter on the red to bring it in line with the blue. I'm still undecided on how this turned out. I don't think I hit the note I was looking for here. It's not bad, but it's not exactly right. I couldn't think of what else I could do to get it closer to what I was thinking, so I put it in the good enough pile and moved on. With Necromancer Cloak, I highlighted the bombs, just hitting the top curves of them where the light would be hitting. Then with Ash Grey, I highlight the fur. I'm just running the side of my brush along the fur, which picks out the highlights nicely. A lot of the highlights on this model are just really easy. It's nice when the model does a lot of the work for you. Considering how much metal there is on this model, the metal highlighting is actually pretty quick. Once again, it's a nice open model, which makes it pretty easy to hit things. So I hit the top of the gun, the rotor supports, the pipes, and any part of the engine that I think needs hitting, mostly the rivets and the large flat areas. Then the final highlight for the gyrocopter itself is the gold. Once again, this step is pretty easy. Just work around the model and pick out any of the gold parts that are facing upwards. Now that the gyrocopter is done, it's time to work on the pilot. I start with the chainmail. For this, I do an overbrush with the plate mail, making sure the purple shadows are still showing in the recesses. This is such a simple way of doing chainmail, and it always looks good. If I wasn't using a universal shadow colour for the army, I'd paint the chainmail parts black first, then do an overbrush of my metal colour. Then I block in the rest of the metal. I was 50-50 on if I should do the rest of the metal now or wait till I had done the other colours, and it really comes down to your preference. In the end, I did it now because I'm lazy and it meant I didn't have to change the water out yet. But either way, you want to do the chainmail first because the overbrushing can be a bit messy. This guy actually has a decent amount of leather on him. Between his weapon grip, gloves, and boots, it takes up a decent chunk of the model. This is mostly because the old metal sculpts have oversized hands and feet. That does make them easier to highlight later though. There aren't really many spots to get my army colours in on this guy, just the sleeves and the pants. In the end, I decided to do them both the same colour and settled on the blue. You could definitely do them different colours, but I decided it wasn't worth the effort. It'd have a very small impact on the model, and the increase of the work would just be disproportional. The handle for the axe is wood, so that got hit with oak brown. I decided to go with a blonde beard for the pilot. There's a lot of brown on the model between the wood and the leather, so I didn't want a brown beard. And I feel like being a gyrocopter pilot is a young dwarf's job, so I didn't want to go white or grey. That narrowed it down to blonde or black. There's no real reason why I picked blonde over black, and I think either would have been fine. For the tiny amount of flesh, which is just his lips and nothing else, I used Topaz flesh. Then for the inside of his mouth, I used Magecast Magenta. You may be asking why I didn't do these two the other way around, and the answer is simple. I'm an idiot, that's why. Thanks for bringing it up. Then the bomb got hit with black to keep it consistent with the ones on the gyrocopter. I also did the fuse uniform grey. I'm not actually sure this needs to be a different colour to the bomb, but either way I did it different, so I should show it on camera. Then with the hammered copper I block in the helmet trim and wings. His belt also has a lot of medallions on it which I hit too. Not that you'll really be able to see them once he's on the gyrocopter, but it's worth doing them either way, just in case. Then it was once again time to establish shadows, so out comes the purple tone again. The hair, leather, and gold all get a full wash with this, then the metal just gets some selective shadows. Highlighting the beard on this guy is a bit tricky. You can't dry brush it because of all the other details around. For a decent portion of the beard, you can run the side of your brush along it to pick out the highlights, but there are definitely some points you'll need some brush control. For those parts, make sure you just brace your hands well, have a comfortable direction, and just take your time. Then with pure ice yellow, I just pick out the final highlights. This part is easier as it's a very fine highlight, and the part where I needed brush control for the previous step is in shadow, so I can ignore it. To highlight the leather, it was a 50-50 mix of leather brown and ice yellow. Why did I use ice yellow for the mix this time instead of ancient stone? Once again, the answer is that I'm lazy, and ice yellow was still on my palette while the ancient stone on my palette had dried out a bit too much. Then I started to highlight the blue. The first layer was deep blue, just picking out the creases in the sleeves and the parts of the pants that are facing upwards. Then Ultramarine Blue to finish them off. Once again, it was Necromancer Cloak to highlight the bomb, just working along the top of the curve. To highlight the gold, it's Greedy Gold. I did highlight the medallions on the back of his belt, but I actually think this was a mistake. Even if these parts can be seen when he's on the gyrocopter, they'd definitely be in shadows, so they shouldn't be highlighted. The rest of the gold was once again a simple case of just running the side of my brush along it to pick out the raised parts. Then the final model for the highlight is Shinning Silver on the rest of the medals. And after a bit of glue, we're done. I'm pretty happy with how the gyrocopter came out, and he put in some great work for me on the table at the event I played in the other weekend. I definitely want a second one for my army, and I'm looking forward to painting one of the newer ones once they're re-released with the dwarfs. Assuming that ever actually happens. When is that release? It was announced months ago. I think 3 hours for the gyrocopter and another hour for the pilot is a good time. 4 hours is not much at all for something that will realistically be a centerpiece for a dwarf army. We don't have any really big models for our centerpiece, so it's our war machines that take that place. If you've hung around this long, I assume you've enjoyed the video, so why not hit that like button, and if you want to see more of my dwarfs painted, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, catch you in the next video.